things.
Oh, I just finished the last of the beer I had at the house, so I'm settling for whiskey right now.
Okay. So you're running out of beer. That's a
I'm
problem.
just going to the store again tomorrow.
Okay.
Dare I ask, Zachary, what flavor and brand of the whiskey you're enjoying?
This is Colonel Taylor. It's bourbon, and I enjoy it a lot. It's really good. I was deciding between this Eagle Rare and Woodford. I mean, I have a lot downstairs. That was just what I was thinking about before we started our family Zoom call.
Eagle Rare is getting hard to find up here, but I just somebody gave me an alert on Wednesday that the local shop right up the street had it, so I jumped up there and got a bottle of it.
Yeah, I got mine from Alex when I had my bachelor party. He gave me a bottle of it, and he had given me a bottle of it as a gift. And then he got a phone call from his friend at their liquor store that they just got Colonel Taylor in, which is getting hard to find, well, which is normal hard to find. So we just drove over there and bought a bottle of that.
So you can see, Dieter, we get out of our houses for the important things in life.
Yeah. That's what I do.
Grocery stores and liquor stores.
Oh, and Dave, Scott, who's joining down there, that's Stacy's father.
Oh. Hello, Scott.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Scott.
I'm Dave.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Well, we are past the top of the hour, so why don't we go ahead and kick this thing off, get the discussion started, and if others want to join us, they certainly can. Jeff, would you like to introduce what we're up to here today?
Greetings, gentlemen. Welcome to Beer Chat 3, hosted by our friend Dave Green today with the topic at hand, which we're very excited about. This is hosted by the Mabel Tainter, a 130-year-old theater located in western Wisconsin, and you guys are part of awesome content that we're providing during our quarantine time, so I really appreciate it. With folks coming in, we'll see how we do as far as muting goes. If not, then just throw it up on the chat, and I'll make sure that I get you in there for a question with Dave or anything else. At the end of Dave's official presentation, of course, I'll open up all the microphones, and then we can just chat with each other until our beer runs out. Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. This little social fun here is we initially set it up for an hour. The beer chats number 1 and number 2 lasted about 90 minutes. I guess it meant we were having a pretty good time. I certainly think so. We'll see how this goes today. We may suffer a similar enjoyable fate. I suspect we might. Just real quick before we kick off here, I want to do one little important piece of housekeeping here. Jeff, I presume you'll be recording this. In fact, I see you are. So I wanted to let everybody know that this social distancing togetherness is being recorded for future online sharing purposes. Depending upon your level of participation, your voice, picture, and or video may be captured as part of the recording. If you choose to not participate in this recorded session, please feel free to exit the Zoom meeting at this time. For everyone that is participating, please keep it respectful and tasteful. We certainly hope you'll enjoy this event, this third in a series, and we absolutely welcome your feedback about it, including topics you might like to speak about in a future beer chat session. For now, feel free to enjoy beer with us. I've got mine at the ready as we belly up to the longest virtual bar in the world. And so without any further ado, let's get social with Dave from Cincinnati, Ohio, USA. Brewmaster Dave, take it away.
Good. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So welcome to the longest virtual bar in the world, seeking out smoke beers today. On several occasions over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking a little bit about brewing process and different beer styles and things like that. Last session, 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about gruits, the topic of smoked beers and smoking grains came up during that call. So we thought it might be interesting to explore smoked beers a little bit deeper for those that have never enjoyed them or they don't know anything about them. So we'll talk a little bit about them today, and then just to kick it off, I'll probably cover some of the just how you make beer, what's the ingredients of beer, what the brewing process is, not in depth, just very lightly. so we could tie it into the smoked beer styles and why smoked beers are smoked. So it helps to kind of set the stage a little bit as to why they're smoky. We'll dig into one of the key ingredients of smoked beer and how it gets its nuance. Talk a bit about the history of smoked beer, where it came from, and the different styles that you can make out of the smoked grains. And then last but not least, I'll talk a little bit about how to enjoy a smoked beer, what you can expect if you've never had one before, what kind of foods it goes with, that type of thing. So let's get rolling here. So just to kick us off on the beer process, there are 4 ingredients, and Dieter talked about 4 ingredients when we talked about alt beer as it tied into the Reinheitsgebot, which is a purity law, a Bavarian purity law. And it states that beer can only be made of 4 things: water, barley, hops, and yeast, which you can see depicted here. If you've never seen hops before, it's the green stuff on the screen. It's a flower, and it grows on a vine. And it's probably would be considered the spice that's in the beer. The grain is more of the heart of the beer. It's what gets fermented, what gets turned into alcohol. The hops are what gives it that flowery or spicy flavor. So those are 4 ingredients. The process here depicted on the right, and it's a lot more complicated than this, but some of the terms you'll hear about, you might have already heard as mashing. That's where you take the grain that you're going to use. It's already ground up. You put it in the mashing vessel or the mash tun. You put water in it, and you let it rest at certain temperatures. And in those temperatures, it's converting the starches in the grain into sugars. So once you're done with that, it goes into the lautering tun, which basically is just filtering all that water out. You put some more water on the top, so it's getting all that flavor and all that sugar out of the beer. It goes into the boiling container, or the brew kettle, as we call it sometimes. You'll add the hops in there while it's boiling. The hops added at different times, different kinds of hops and different timings will contribute either bitterness to the beer, flavor to the beer, or aroma to the beer. So brewers will throw in different hops at different times during that boil. You cool it down, you put it in the fermenter. That's where you add the yeast. The yeast turns all that sugar into alcohol over time. And then you filter it out, and you put that stuff in a bottle, in a keg, in a can, whatever your preference is to drink the beer. So that's how beer is made. Now, what we're going to do with the rest of this presentation is talk about that one particular ingredient, and that's the barley, because that is really where the smokiness will come from. So many people have heard of barley, and you've heard of malted barley, and it's a process that gets it from barley into malted barley. And the process is kind of here. You grow that barley. When it's ready, you harvest it, and this is what the barley kernels look like once you pull it off the plant. Then you go into the malting procedure. You will take all these barley kernels, you soak them, get them wet, then you lay them out on a floor. And there's different ways to do malting. This is showing the floor malting process. You lay them out on a floor, and they get air, they get heat, they get some of the darkness. And what happens is those little kernels start to germinate. They start to grow in that process. Now the kernels are, at that point in time, have the most food in that little kernel, because they don't have a root at that point. Before they start to germinate, there is no root. So to survive, they have to live off the food in that kernel. That food is a starch. So what you're doing in that malting process is you're activating all that starch and getting it to the point where that little kernel has the most food in it to get that plant off to a good start, so it can start to grow roots and get its nutrients from the soil. at that point in time where it's at the peak of that starch, you want to freeze that. You don't want it to go any further. The plant will grow roots. It could start to rot. You can't store it. You need to stop that action. And then the way you stop that action is by using a kiln and getting that grain hot. And it'll kind of kill all those enzymes in the plant part that's trying to grow, and it freezes that at the point where it's got the maximum starch. And then you've got malted barley. So that's how you get from regular barley to malted barley. And you can kind of see here in this picture, there's a few different shades of the malted barley there. It'll get a different shade. It'll all start with either 2-row or 6-row barley, so they all look the same. And then through the roasting process, based on the temperature that they are getting roasted at and the duration of time that you roast them, you will get different colorations and different flavors of that malted barley. So that doesn't say how it introduces smoke or how this ties into smoked beer, but as you can probably guess by looking at all three of these pictures, there's one of them that may give you a little bit of a clue, and that's the kiln. So smoked beer is all about the kiln. Originally, kilns used open fire that are fueled by a number of different things to produce the heat in order to kiln that beer or kiln that barley. But where there's fire, there's typically smoke. So as the heat rises and goes through that barley, the smoke is going with it. And the smoke cleans to that barley, just like it would when you're smoking meat or you're smoking vegetables or whatever you do in your backyard. That's exactly the same process. So while it's trying to freeze that food source in the barley, it's also getting a smoked flavor. Now, this was really common. Smoked beers are not very common today, as we'll talk about. This was a very common process hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and the only way that you could kiln that barley and get it to stop. So while it's kind of odd today to see a smoked beer, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, almost all beer had some kind of a smoky flavor to it because you were kilning it using an open fire. The flavor would vary based upon what you were using for the source of that fire. So if you were using beechwood, you'd have a certain flavor for that barley. They would use straw. They would use coal. They would use different variances of coal, like a coke, to fuel their fire. Some places it's been read would mix straw with cow dung. That would not make a very pleasant beer in my book, and I have not tried cow dung beer before, and I don't think that I will like that. So we're going to stay away from that. But based upon the fuel source, different amounts of smoke would come in, and it wasn't in high demand. People didn't strive for their beer to be smoky. So if you used coke to smoke the beer, it wouldn't have, or to fire your kiln, it wouldn't have much. It would be a much cleaner taste because it didn't produce much smoke. And those beers were favored because they didn't have that smokiness to them. But coke was very expensive to use, and it was highly taxed back in the industrial age. So not many people used it. So they used whatever was available. In Germany, they had a lot of wood, a lot of beech wood. They had forests that they could get the wood. In England, at this point in time, they had almost deforested all of England. So wood was very expensive and hard to come by. And in some cases, it was illegal to use it, except for certain purposes. So different sources created different flavors. Then in 1635 in England, Sir Nicholas Hulse patented a new kiln, which is really interesting. If you read this text underneath it in the patent itself, and I was able to pull up the patent, it says that this kiln was for the drying of malt and hops with sea coal, turf, or any other fuel without touching of smoke, and very useful for baking, boiling, roasting, starching, and drying of linen all at one time and with one fire. So this was an attempt to produce malted barley without getting that smokiness, so that the beers would not have a smoke flavor. So smoke flavor was going out of favor. It never really was in favor. It was just kind of a byproduct of the way that you made beer. It wasn't until about 1800, so 150 something years later, that technology actually made it to Germany from England. It's very expensive to build kilns and to invest in new technology. So it finally made it to Germany. Spaten had the first smokeless kiln back in 1800. And then it started gradually replacing the Bavarian kilns that they were using. And the smoke beer was hence going out of vogue, and the breweries were producing cleaner lagers. And then in 1817, Daniel Wheeler, also from England, who was an engineer, he patented a new kiln, which really was a game changer, because it was not only smokeless, but it could also roast the grain as well, and gave the brewers control, or the barley companies, the malting companies, gave them more control over the different degrees of kilning that you could do. So that really opened up the door for being able to consistently produce an Oktoberfest or a Marzen style beer in Germany, and consistently get that color and flavor. You could consistently get it created this black patent malt, which is almost the darkest malt that you could use for brewing. So in the UK, you could start consistently making good quality stouts and porters. So it really changed the world of beer just by producing this kiln. And the way this thing works, if you can imagine like a drum, like a barrel, and you turn that barrel on its side, and you put the barley in it, and you rotate it over a fire. So the fire and the smoke is never actually hitting the barley, but you're getting the heat from it. So it's very similar to a coffee roaster. That was what Daniel Wheeler's kiln was like. So pretty cool, and it changed the brewing world. But even as of 1900, there were still some malting companies that hadn't converted over yet. But more specifically, there were breweries in Bamberg, Germany. There were 4 of them at the time that never moved to that new kiln. Those breweries primarily did their own malting, so they weren't buying them from a company that did the malting. They were malting them for their own beers. They kept the old style, the old fire kilns, where there was direct contact of the smoke. And so then at that point in time, when there weren't any other smoked beers, that's when Bamberg Rauchbier became a thing. Before that, smoked beers were just beer. Now they had their own thing, because the only place that they were really making this style beer was in Bamberg. There were 4 breweries in Bamberg in 1900 that were left. There was Polar Bar, I think. Dieter, you're gonna have to correct me on my German pronunciations, but that closed in World War II, so they stopped producing. And there's Greifenklau, that was founded in 1719. It's still a brewery today, but in the 1970s they stopped their own malting, so they purchase their malt. They not only make Rauch beers, but they make other styles of beers as well. And in fact, that if you ever make it to Bamberg, that brewery, Greifenklau, also has a guest house. They have a small hotel attached to the brewery and attached to the restaurant and bar that you can stay there. And my wife and I stayed there back in the early 1900s. My son will think that's probably a true story. In the 1990s, we stayed there. So that was a really cool adventure for us. The Special Brewery in Bamberg was founded in 1536. It's still in operation today, still malting their own barley in this way. And I have not been to Special yet. Schlenkerla is probably the most prevalent of all the Rauch beers in the world. And they're still in operation today in Bamberg. They opened in 1405, or that brewery had a presence in 1405. They're still in operation today. So there's not many breweries that are primarily Rauch beer breweries, and they're centered around Bamberg. So you can see the logos here. The Schlenkerla is a pretty distinctive label. You will, if you go into a beer shop, that label will jump out at you because it looks like, ancient script of some sort. It's very classy looking. So that's how we got to the type of beer called Bamberg Rauch beer. But it's not just a single style. So when we talk about Altbier, it's a style. When we talk about ambers, it's a style. When we talk about stouts and porters, those are a style. Rauch beer is more about the process. It's about using smoked grain in a beer. So when you look at this whole list here on the top, those are all Schlenkerla Rauch beers. Every one of them is a smoked beer. You have the one in the middle, which is what I happen to be drinking right now, is a Bock beer. The one just to the left of that is a Märzen. They have a wheat beer, a Weizen beer. They have one called Krausen. And the Krausen is when you're making beer, Krausening is the process of taking newer beer and mixing it with older beer, and it kind of revitalizes the beer and gives it a little bit different flavor. So what Schlenkerla does is they actually do that when they make this beer. It's a blend of older beer with beer that has just recently been fermented, and produces a unique flavor.
So if I could jump in here real quick, Dave.
Sure, Steve.
That actually tickles my fancy because La Crosse, Wisconsin is where old style beer originated, and their big marketing thing back in the 70s and 80s is that beer old style was kreuzened. And I never knew what kreuzening was.
Yeah.
So basically is it laziness? Or is it actually with intent that you're doing this?
So what they'll do is at bottling time, they'll do that in order, you take a beer that it's not old, it's a beer that's already fermented out, right? So the fermentation process has stopped in that beer. But before you put it in a bottle, you add some new beer to it that's still a little fermenting, and it'll create it creates a natural carbonation while it's sealed off in that bottle.
And that's kreuzening.
Yes, and that's kreuzening.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Now I know all these years later.
Yep, that's what it is.
Thank you.
So you see there's a Hella style there. There's a fast beer here, which they produce only at Lent. And I was actually able to find this beer yesterday, but it looks a bit different than that. And it's in a can. And I have never seen a Schlenkerla beer in a can. So I have a can of this Lent beer. And then there's a double bock in the end. And the bottom ones are the similar styles from Special. So it's not one style. You can make any style of beer using smoked malt, and it'll be a Rauch beer. So these are the ones made in Bamberg, but there are other breweries that are doing smoked beers as well. And with since the probably mid 90s, different microbreweries have experimented with it. There's not many that make a continuous style of a smoked beer. Usually they make them just for a special batch that they're doing, or seasonal in the fall. Some of them will make for example, you folks in Wisconsin will recognize New Glarus. So New Glarus does make smoked beers, but they don't have one continuously on their docket. They've made smoked wheat beers. They've made smoked rye beers. And I don't know if they have it on a schedule, or you just have to kind of wait and see when they produce them. This picture right here is of their smoked rye, which I know as of a couple years ago, they had it I think it was in the fall. They had it, and it's supposedly very good. I've never been able to find it down here in Cincinnati.
So I'm gonna
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna ask my my local beer expert here, who I see has joined us, Mr. Keith Paul. He would know, I would think, if this New Glarus beer is available regionally currently.
The smoked rye ale, I don't think so. I wouldn't. I love New Glarus, but I don't think I've had that beer. It looks good.
Okay.
But all beers
it's a pretty beer. Yeah.
I think Steve oversold the expert portion of that speech.
Well, look, you knew what was at the Menominee grocery store, so I figured you knew if this thing was around.
I do like New Glarus, and I watch out for their beers. And
Yeah,
their
you
beers,
should
but
definitely watch out for it.
All right.
So some of the other, larger craft beer companies that you'll recognize: Rogue and Stone, Samuel Adams. This one over here to the right, this Alaskan Porter, that's probably, as far as I can tell, at least it was the first American craft beer that I ever had that was a smoked beer. And they started making this smoked porter back in the late 80s or early 90s. And it was really a new thing around the craft beer community. But they don't use like the smoked grains that came out of the malting process. They actually take grains that had already been malted, and there's a local smokehouse there that smokes fish, and they close down the smoking for periods of time to clean the smokehouse out, and when it's just not a time when they've got a lot of business. And there's a once a year there's like a 10-day period where the brewers from the Alaskan Brewing Company take their grain and they smoke continuously for like 7 days, or that's what they were doing at that point in time. They might do it longer now, I don't know, but back in the 90s, they were doing it for like 7 days and smoking all the grains that they would use, and they would produce a batch of the Alaskan Porter, and it's delicious. So a smoked porter is a phenomenal thing. So if you ever get a chance to try that, it's good. Brewery Ommegang, which is a Belgian-style brewery in Cooperstown, New York, they also make fabulous beers, world-class Belgian-style ales, and they make a smoked porter occasionally as well. It's not normally on their docket either, and I don't know what their schedule is, or even if they're making it anymore. I had it once. Cherrywood, you'll see that. That is a beer that is made year-round, and it's made here in Cincinnati by a brewery called the Taft Brewing Company. And they don't advertise it as a smoked beer. You won't see it on the label. It's just called Cherrywood, and it's a delicious beer, but it's very lightly smoked. So they must use a blend of regular barley and smoked barley. I've not talked to anybody down there that knew about the process yet, but I'm curious to talk to them and find out how they buy their barley from a company that smokes like they would in Bamberg, or do they smoke it afterwards? I'm thinking they might smoke it afterwards because they serve a lot of smoked food there. So I'm wondering if they use their own smokers at the restaurant that they have and smoke the grain. But I don't know. We'll try to find that out at some point in time. And also, speaking of malters, there's a company in Wisconsin that you may have heard of if you are or have ever homebrewed or walked through a brewery and saw pallets of malted barley. The company is called Brees, and they make a smoked grain. So if you're a home brewer, you can actually now buy the grain from them. You can also, there are other brands that are imported. I used to buy a lot. I used to buy 50-pound bags of smoked barley that was coming from Bamberg because nobody in the U.S. was making it. Now you can get it locally made in the U.S. And this other one here, which I think is my favorite label of all time, tying back to a conversation I was just having with Steve earlier about me being a bagpiper. So this beer is called McFanny Ball, B-A-W. You can't see the W on the end. But there's a brewery down in Louisville, Kentucky called Against the Grain, and they are a smokehouse as well. They have a fabulous restaurant right across the street from Angels in the distillery, and they smoke their grains there and make this Scottish ale, which it's a smoked Scottish ale aged in bourbon barrels, and it is a phenomenal beer. So if you want a really interesting smoky adventure, look for Against the Grain beers. They do sell those in Ohio. I don't know if they sell them in Wisconsin or not, but it's worth seeking out. It is an awesome beer, and all their labels are kind of in this cartoony kind of print as well. So they kind of stand out. Freigeist, which was a beer that I had a couple weeks ago on a call, they make a smoked Lichtenheiner, I think is the way you pronounced it, or Lichtenheiner, and it's very good. I actually have one of those sitting on my desk behind me right now as well. So that's just, so the tradition continues making smoked beer, but they're not easy to find. You really have to kind of seek them out. But it's cool that companies are still making this style of beer.
Several of those, Dave, are porters. Is there a correlation? Why would it seems that the Rauch beer tends to gravitate toward porters? Why is that, do you figure?
So the German style beers are all common German styles of beer, just made with smoked malt. The porters are a little more experimental, and the roasted barleys that you have in a porter, when you drink one that's not smoked, are a little bit coffee-like. You can really get that roastiness and the flavor, and it pairs really well with smoked grains. So Alaskan Brewing Company started making that porter. People loved it, and so now other companies in the U.S. have emulated the porters. I don't know if there's any breweries in the UK that are making smoked porters, but it was at one point in time. You have to remember back that prior to those smokeless kilns, all these beers had a smoky flavor to it. So porters had a smoky flavor to it, and it was, I mean, it's just, it tastes great together. It just tastes fabulous. So here's kind of a list. If you've never gone out and looked at the Brewers Association, which is a professional association for breweries, they've got a website, brewersassociation.org, and every year they publish the guidelines for all beer styles. And I have that on my phone at all times, so that if you go somewhere and you hear of a new beer style, you can pull it up and say, okay, if they're brewing this authentically, the original gravity should be in this range. The final gravity should be in this range. They should have this many international bittering units of hops. It should have this flavor profile, and it's really helpful. And if you're a home brewer, you've got to have access to this, because if you're trying to make a beer, it gives you any beer style that you can imagine. And it's actually what, when they do beer judging in the United States, they use those guidelines. Even homebrew judging will use those guidelines. So the judges will have to memorize all of these different characteristics of the beer. So look at that. If you'll be amazed at the number of beer styles that are out there around the world, and many historic beers as well. But these are the styles of smoked beers that are in the Brewers Association beer style. So you can see smoked porters at the top. You have the Bamberg style beers here. The Marzen, Helles, Bock, and Weiss beer are all recognized as specific styles by the Brewers Association. This I've never had one of these. This is a Polish style called Grodziskie or Grodzis. Somebody with a Polish background may know how to pronounce that. But it's a it's a 100% wheat beer, but it's all made with smoked wheat. So it's going to be very light in body, and with a very distinct smoked nuance to it. There's this Swedish style also that's made, you use birch wood in it, but they also, it also has distinct flavors of juniper berries. So they put birch wood, they smoke the grain over birch wood, and then they also use wood while it's fermenting as well. I've not had one of those. I've never have seen one of those. This style beer, this Lichtenheiner, is that how you say that, Dieter? Lichtenheiner?
Dieter's muted.
Okay. But it's a German style. I think it's from the eastern side of Germany, but its distinction is it's a sour beer as well, but it's lightly smoked, and I've had this beer before. This is one that I mentioned that Freigeist out of Cologne makes. I've not had theirs yet. There's a brewery in Cleveland, a small German brewery in Cleveland, that makes this style of beer, and they only sell it in the brewery. I've had it on a number of occasions. It's very good. And then, yeah.
I think it's called Lichtenheiner.
Lichtenheiner. Okay.
Yeah, Lichtenheiner is East Germany, as you said. It's close to the border to Poland,
Okay.
where our dear Chancellor is from.
Ah, okay.
Uckermark.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good to see you, Tomas. And then there's also these Scottish style beers that it's optional to have them as smoked or not, and usually they're smoked with peat. So just like they use peat smoked barley for making Scottish whiskies, it's acceptable to use peat smoked barley in making Scottish style beers. And there's a few different Scottish style beers. There's a light ale, a heavy ale, an expert, and the Scotch ale, which is also called a wee heavy. So sometimes when you get a Scotch ale, it will have smokiness to it. Sometimes it won't. That example that I had of the one from down in Louisville, Kentucky, is a Scotch ale, and it's definitely smoky. And again, that one's also aged in bourbon barrels, so you get a double hit of intenseness. So these are all the different smoke styles, smoke beer styles. Now there is also an exception that in the Brewers Association, they also have a category that's just called smoked beers. So with that one, when you're getting your beer judged, it doesn't have to be one of these specific styles. It can be any style. Like you could make a Belgian framboise that you use smoked grain. That would probably not be great, but it would, if you were going to have it judged, it would fall into that kind of generic, just smoked beer category. Typically, you would have to tell them what style of beer that you're trying to make, and using smoke grain. And then when you judge it, they'll judge it based upon its the smokiness as well as the original style that you're trying to emulate as well. So how do you enjoy it? Michael Jackson, and not the Michael Jackson that you're probably all thinking of, but there was a beer author and beer journalist named Michael Jackson. I think he died in the late 90s or early 2000s, but he was also known as the beer hunter. He was British, and he would travel around the world, go to breweries, write books about breweries. He had a TV show. I think it might have only been in the UK. I'm not sure, where he would travel around to breweries and talk about them. And this was way before the huge influx of craft beer brewing. And if you ever can find his books, they're great. He produced a book called The New World Guide to Beer, which was my Bible back in late 80s and 90s, where I learned a lot about different beer styles and beer locations and where I wanted to travel to try these different beers. But his quote here is this is the beer world's answer to a single malt Scotch whiskey, especially of the Islay type. So those of you familiar with Scotch whiskeys, the Islay types are those that have that extreme peatiness, very smokiness, and that's what you can expect when you're trying a beer. A lot of people who have never had a smoky or peaty Scotch and they try a smoked beer, it's a very weird sensation. You don't expect that smokiness coming from a liquid. So some people like it right away. If you love smoked foods, you will probably taste this and say, this is incredible. If you're not a fan of smoked foods, you will probably taste this and say, this may not be for me. However, finish the bottle that you open, have another one, and then probably by the end of that second one, you'll probably say, okay, I get it. This is, I get what they're trying to do, and this is really something different, and I like it. Now, in Bamberg, I think this is funny. They had a saying that it takes somebody 3 to 5 liters of Rauch beer to acquire a taste for it. I think that's probably good marketing to sell 3 to 5 liters of Rauch beer, because most people that I know that try it after a bottle or two really, really like it. But you can't just take a sip of it and judge it that way. You've got to drink it and let your palate come up to speed with that beer. It is awesome paired with food. So I don't typically like it with food that's been smoked. That's just too much smoke for me. But like grilled sausages or grilled steaks, it's terrific with anything that comes off the grill. Hearty cheeses, I love it sitting down with some sausage and a good aged Gouda or aged cheddars. It tastes awesome. Even smoked Goudas, since smoked Goudas aren't too intensely smoked, they taste very good with the Rauch beers as well. Roasted pork is the best. That's my favorite combination. But also like some sweets. And if you've ever had like whiskey with caramel or whiskey with chocolate, it kind of gives you that same nuance. They go really well together. So smoked beers. And then I know this last one is a little weird, but I tried it once and it was delicious. So just like a maple donut with maybe some caramel or maple icing on it and a smoked beer. Oh, it's a nice way to end the night until you can sit down with your cigar, and then it all comes together. So a nice cigar and a nice Rauch beer are delightful together. Yes,
Dave. I'm just wondering how it goes with cheese curds. Any idea?
I bet it would go great with a cheese curd.
He only bets though, huh? Are you not a cheese curd expert there, Dave, yet?
I have had quite a few cheese curds. Used to live outside of Chicago, and we would go up to Wisconsin quite a bit. We had English setters that we bought from a breeder up outside of Milwaukee, and so we would go up there. We belonged to a English setter club up there, so we would cross the border quite frequently and stop at Mars Cheese Factory and pick up bags of cheese curds to bring home with us.
Okay, Steve, is this what we tried in the cheese factory where you took me to?
Yeah, when you and Mary Lou were there, we tried the cheese curds, the fresh ones.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
I don't know that I remember you being particularly enamored with them or liking them a whole lot. I don't think they're a hearty cheese from the list. I think they're more of a light cheese.
No, it was quite a nice experience.
So that is what I had prepared. So let the chatter begin.
Dave, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Absolutely. Let's let the discussion go. You can certainly unmute yourself and start being part of the conversation. Ask a question. A little more bashful, you can raise your hand, or you can use the chat window to send a question or a comment over. But let's get the dialogue going. That was great, Dave. Thank you.
Yeah, quite welcome. It was fun.
Thanks,
question
Dave. Yeah.
for Scott. Was that the same Michael Jackson we were talking about the other day? Oops.
Scott, I think you're muted.
We were having a discussion about whiskey and scotch the other day, and we were talking about Michael Jackson, I believe.
Yeah, that's the same guy. He also he was the one that wrote I think it's called The Pocket Guide to Whiskey.
Well, I think Scott has if I remember right, I think he has a signed copy of one of his books that
cool.
he has. Was that the same one?
He conducted a Scotch tasting that I was fortunate enough to attend in Austin, Texas, probably 2 decades plus ago. It was actually sponsored by a brewer store called St. Patrick's. So it was a brewing supply house that actually brought them to Austin for the Scotch tasting at a local hotel.
Oh, wow. That would have been fantastic.
It was pretty neat.
So, Dave, you're a bit of a home brewer. Do you start at the beginnings? Do you do your own malting? Do you do your own smoked beer? Have you done a smoked beer before?
Oh yeah, I've made many smoked beers. I used to. I've never malted grain. That's way too difficult to do that.
Well, it looks like it's just rake it out on the floor and you're done with it, isn't it?
Yeah. Take your living room, throw it on there, send your wife away for a while. But I have before I could get smoked grain in the U.S. Me and there's a brewery in Cincinnati. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's really good. They make very artful beers called Listerman. And and Dan and I brewed together quite a bit back in the 90s. We belonged to the same homebrew club, and we both had he was stationed in Bamberg, I believe. And we started kind of taking different grains and trying different woods and smoking them and making beer out of them. And my favorite wood was actually to use was apple. And it didn't impart any kind of apple flavoring. It was just the smoke flavor would just worked really well with the beer. So we did that for a while. Then Dan started manufacturing homebrew equipment. Had enough room to open a homebrew store, so then he could import the Bamberg malt from Bamberg, and so that's when I started buying it from there. So I've made a number, and Dan actually makes every year we have in Cincinnati, we have something called Bockfest in February every year. It's a celebration of Bock beer. And back when it started in the 90s, there were probably 4 or 5 breweries in Cincinnati that made a Bock beer for Bockfest. Now there was, I think this year there were like 55 or 60 Bock beers at Bockfest, but Dan always makes a smoked Bock beer, which is really good. So yeah, I've made quite a few smoked beers.
I remember I've had some of Dave's smoked beers in the past. They were pretty good. Tell them about your run at the Bockfest this year, Dave.
Oh yeah, so at Bockfest this year in February, with the proliferation of all these different 5Ks and things like that, they had a 0.05K. I think it was a 0.05K. It ended up, whatever it was, it ended up being about 600 feet.
Even that's too far for me. Oh, Dave.
I think he's frozen.
Yeah.
He's been frozen before, believe me.
What does it take to thaw the man? That's the question.
Probably some beer.
Well, he's got a table full of them behind him. He should spin around. So do we have other folks on the call here that are home brewers? Anybody else tried their hand at brewing stuff at home or fermenting anything?
No.
No, never tried that.
We drink beer, not brew it.
Right, yeah. I was quite lucky. I found a Rauch beer, and it's called Bockwurst Bock from Gruthaus Brewery in Münster. It has 7.8% alcohol.
Whew.
And what I learned when I bought that beer is it's smoked on beechwood, and it's produced in collaboration with a butcher, and they smoke it in the same oven where Bockwurst is smoked.
Hmm.
And if you taste it, it tastes like an open fire and a Bockwurst on an open campfire. It's really good. And Dave, when I read that, I learned that. Do you know where the name Bock is coming from for Bock beer? Because it goes together with Bockwurst. It's usually served together with Bockwurst in Germany.
I'm seeing that
Bockwurst is a sausage.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that Dave has exited here. He must have had to sign out and sign back in. So we'll hear about Bock beer, because that's one of my favorites. As Dave noted early on, is Shiner Bock, which is of course now a national beer. Our Texas friends on the call here may know about the Shiner Bock beer, but I'd be curious to learn about the Bock beer.
But on restaurant menus in Texas, they listed under imported beers.
Yeah,
I've
really?
always wondered where that came from, but they charge a premium now.
Yeah.
It used to be very cheap when I was in college.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I can tell you here is so when I was visiting schools back in, this would have been 1989, I toured a couple of different schools. I went to Utah, I went to South Carolina, I went to Wisconsin-Madison, where, of course, I was going to go to school, and I went to Austin, Texas. And when I went to Austin, Texas, they took me out to the County Line Barbecue, and they served me up these pitchers of Shiner Bock beer. And that's when I became an honorary Texan.
Oh, County Line Barbecue. The one close to me closed down recently.
Oh, no.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yeah. And I enjoyed that place. But it's not like you can't find barbecue in Texas.
Fair point.
You can find what?
Barbecue.
Smoked meat to go with your smoked beer.
Okay.
Oh, Dave's back.
Dave's back, yeah.
We have to stop talking about him, though.
Hi, Thomas. How are you doing?
Gotta unmute yourself, Thomas.
Now I'm here. I'm fine. I never heard about Rauch beer before, so to get prepared for this evening, I went to several shops to buy this one. So
what is that?
There it is.
All right. Yeah.
And it was really hard to get it. So in one shop, I got 4 bottles.
All right. So you're prepared for the evening. All right.
Do you have the Marzen, or do you have the Urbach?
It's the Marzen.
Yeah.
And I went to other shops as well, and they told me, yeah, we had it in the past, but it's not. They're not selling well, and at the end they have to pay for it to get it to the customers. So they will not offer it anymore. So it's not really famous here in this region, I would say.
Yeah.
But for me, it's the first time, and I like smoky whiskies, peated whiskies from Scotland, and yeah, it's famous. It's great. I think you cannot drink too much from this one, but it's interesting to hear that you can combine it with meat from the barbecue. I think that fits, yeah.
I highly recommend that.
Thomas, I have to ask, that picture that's behind you that looks familiar, that's not, what is that?
This one?
Yeah.
Australia, right?
From Australia.
Yeah.
Okay. For whatever reason, and the Texans on the call, I was thinking Enchanted Rock for those that have been there.
Yeah.
No, that's That's the one from Australia. My parents live like 30 minutes from Enchanted Rock.
Okay. A little bit different, I guess. A little bit less imposing than that one. But
we went there for holiday, for vacation, and we made some photos, and this is one of these.
Oh, really? You took that photo?
Yeah, I took that photo, and then I get it printed on I think it's 2 meters 40, and it's really hard because the camera, I have a good camera, but 2 meter 40, or what is it in inch? I don't know. Do you know?
A bunch of inches.
Steve math.
And it's still hard to get a good resolution for the picture, but it's okay. I like it.
That's awesome. Are you something of a photographer?
Oh, it's just a hobby, like beer.
So it says you're from Duisburg. What?
Duisburg is next to Düsseldorf. So it's around about 30 kilometers from Düsseldorf, and I would say 70 kilometers to Cologne. I think these are the big cities.
70, yeah.
And so are you guys more alt beer folks then? Is the Rauch beer is a little bit outside of your norm, right? But is Duisburg then all about alt beer or Kolsch or Duischisch beer?
In fact, Duisburg is a Pilsner, a Pils beer. Pilsner beer.
Yep.
They have an own brewery. It's called the König Pilsner, the King's Pilsner, which I prefer. And I think Dieter, he already mentioned in the last session something about the alt beer. Was the first one? I don't know, which is totally different. So, in Duisburg, I would say it's Pilsner beer.
Yeah,
you can
get is Pils area, absolutely. But Thomas drinks everything. I know that. Whatever you give him, he drinks it.
That's why I
you can get that König
That's the reason why he's here.
Yeah, I think the last time I saw Thomas was he had a clown wig on, I think.
It's a few months ago.
Yeah.
Be careful. That brings us back to the Smurf story.
Oh, wait, no. No. Let's not go there.
Yeah, we were working on a project together in Düsseldorf in telecommunication industry. We had a good time in the old town.
Yeah.
So, Greg, did you have
come out for a second and get another beer?
Oh, good plan.
Yeah.
Greg, did you have a comment or a question to make? It looked like you were going to chime in with something.
It's like, I just think Lions is the best beer in Wisconsin.
What's the best beer in Wisconsin?
Liney's.
Liney's.
Oh, Liney's.
Yeah, I don't know if Liney's ever made a smoked beer. They've made almost every style of beer that you can possibly imagine.
Right. Yeah, I don't think they did a smoked one either.
No.
Okay, guys. Well, it's been fun. Thank you, Dave, for the information. I've got to jump off and go get some dinner. Nice to meet you guys.
See you,
Thanks for joining us.
Have a good night, Zach.
Bye, guys.
Thanks very much.
So, if I can step back a couple of beer chats here, I don't believe Dieter shared with us that the original alt beers were smoky.
Yeah, all beers were pretty much smoky, and it's interesting that I guess the degree of smokiness probably varied, but it wasn't a popular thing. They were trying to figure out how to get it out. And so, like, for example, if you use straw to fuel your fire, straw did not produce a lot of smoke, especially unless it was wet straw. But it didn't produce a lot of smoke, didn't give a ton of smokiness to the beer. However, it was a huge fire hazard because you had to constantly tend that fire, and parts would blow out, and kilns would catch on fire and things like that. So there were beers that weren't as intensely as smoky as the ones that used beechwood. But I would imagine that back in the before the 1700s or even into the 1800s, that the beers, even alt beers, had some smokiness to them because of how you had to fire your kilns.
I can't judge that. I don't know. I'm not old enough for that.
What are you drinking now,
What
Dieter?
time is it? What time is it, guys?
5 o'clock. What time is it where you are?
My birthday.
Oh!
Hey, happy birthday, Dieter.
Thanks.
Happy birthday,
Happy
Dieter.
birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Dieter. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you, thank you.
So you're 39 now?
It was a Groot beer.
Oh, good.
Now, Mr. Gilmartin, are you drinking a Groot beer for Dieter's birthday? You're muted, Tom.
Yeah, so going back to the last 2 weeks ago, the night Joe gave his really good presentation.
Yeah.
So Joe, that runs the Hags Brewery in my local town here in the west of Ireland. I called down to Joe yesterday and just asked him to put some stuff in a box and give me some mix of beers. But I wanted to try a couple of Groot beers. So he gave me this one, and I think he mentioned this 2 weeks ago. It's the Heather Sour.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So 6.9%, but I've taken my time to drink it, so I'm still standing here. So quite a nice beer. I think that's the great thing about these couple of meets. I'm not a beer connoisseur, like Keith kind of said earlier. We drink beer, and that's what I do, and I don't really pass much heed. And if I like it, I drink it. So this has been a great forum for complete novices, and leaning on Dave's knowledge and Dieter that kicked it all off. It's been a great experience for me. So the Heather Sour has gone down really well, and you can get the heathery taste of it. There's no lack of heather in Ireland. Well, in the west of Ireland, there's tons of heather. So I'm glad that Joe is making use of our what's usually a nuisance product for most people, but Joe's making great use of it. But yeah, the Heather Sour, the group beer, is going down really nice.
Fantastic.
Are you a Irish whiskey connoisseur?
Can't say I am. No. No, I don't really know too much about whiskey. I have to be honest.
There's a huge surge of Irish whiskeys coming into the U.S. now, so they're doing a great job competing with. They're not up to the level of the Scotch whiskeys coming in, but there are a lot of really good.
Oh my
Irish
God,
whiskeys
Dave,
coming in.
you were doing so well there.
Let me rephrase that. So it's a quality thing, not a quantity thing. There are some fantastic Irish whiskeys, but there's a plethora of Scottish whiskeys.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of competition between both. So again, probably like your beers, there's so many nuances to the brewing process, and I can't admit I've ever dug deep into that. But Steve, anything I brought you over, you were kind of happy with. I made sure to bring you some Irish whiskey.
Yeah, so strangely and sadly, I've really only grown a palate for Jameson's, and I'm not a whiskey drinker, but Jameson's, I think it's the black casket, the black cask, whatever it is divine. And you brought over something else this last time. I can't remember the name of it. That was also very good. And not to shift the conversation away from beer toward whiskey, and Dave, if you could digitally reach through and slap me, you'd probably do so. But the scotches that I've enjoyed have paled in comparison to the Irish whiskeys that I've enjoyed. Maybe that says something about me as a human, but I actually really, really like the Irish whiskeys. Why do you suppose, what's the difference between an Irish whiskey and a scotch?
So typically, I mean, there's like 5 different regions in Scotland that produce whiskeys, and they each have their own different flavor nuances. So I'm sure that you could probably find one that's closer to the flavor profile of an Irish whiskey. But Irish whiskeys, typically, like the newer Irish whiskeys are pot stilled versus column stilled. So it's the kind of still that they're made in. It's a smaller still.
Really?
Yeah. The process is very similar, but I find that I like Irish whiskeys as well. So a lot of the newer ones, Yellow Spot, Green Spot, are terrific whiskeys. If you haven't had those, you should seek those out. They're really good. And there's lots of good Irish whiskeys that you should try. But I think it's probably the pot skills. Now Jameson's, I don't think is a pot stilled whiskey. I could be wrong, but it's so probably a lot of the scotches that you've tried might have been these more heavily peaty scotches that had this very this kind of smoky flavor to them, but some of them are just so over the top. I don't really care for them. I could probably drink one, but it's just too intense for me. But there are some, like from the Highlands, that are less intense. They don't have that peaty, smoky profile to them. I'm not a whiskey expert, but that's just on personal taste. My brother down here, Ken, is a bourbon expert.
Yeah, I don't know about that. But...
Well, hold on a second. We've got another bourbon connoisseur, Mr. McSweeney, on the line here. We heard what was it, Woodford? We heard Woodford mentioned earlier from Zachary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll admit that is, as bourbons go, I think that's a bourbon, right?
It is.
It is a bourbon.
Woodford makes some other whiskeys also besides just bourbons.
Okay. Well, that's Jeff introduced me to those, and yeah, really, really nice.
Yeah, that's a great place to visit if you ever go down there. It's just beautiful. It's
beautiful distillery.
Yeah, it's situated right in the middle of Kentucky horse country, so you're surrounded by these huge horse farms, and yeah, it's just gorgeous. It is probably the most picturesque distillery that I've ever been to.
I agree with you, Dave. I've been to the Bourbon Trail 3 times and have truly enjoyed it. Even if you're not a bourbon drinker, to go and do the tours and see all that, it's just incredible.
You learn a lot when you do that. It's really cool how much you can pick up about the process, and they are so proud of the history of bourbon and in the region, and the water that they use, and the grain that they grow down there, and the processes that they use. It's a lot of fun if you ever get the chance to go down there and spend a few days, or even just a day.
That Buffalo Trace is. I love the picturesque use at Woodford, but the process that you get when you get a Buffalo Trace and everything that they talk about is just phenomenal. So those are probably my 2 favorite distilleries to go to.
How are the processes different?
But the processes are the same, but each distiller in the trail, when it was set up, was assigned to do a different purpose of the distillery. It's just Buffalo Trace is a very scientific. It has a very scientific base. They do experiments about if we grow a tree at the bottom of a hill versus a tree at the top of the hill, how does the amount of sunlight and rain that the trees get, how does that make the bourbon taste different? And they do a lot of phenomenal job of those experiments. That with Woodford has a great product, and make that product and very few others. Whereas Buffalo Trace always has new experimental batches coming out. So.
They experiment with the size of the barrel. You know, does the size of the barrel you use, is it better to have huge barrels or smaller barrels, and how the whiskeys age? They do a lot of that kind of thing.
A stone rickhouse versus a wood rickhouse versus a metal rickhouse versus what floor it's on, whether it's you open it up to air or not, and it's
just a question, because I'm not so familiar with these distilleries in Kentucky. Is it a trip you can book on the internet, for example, and you go from one distillery to the next, or what is that? Or
yeah, there's something called the Bourbon Trail.
Hey guys, sorry running late.
This is starting to be a theme with you, Claude.
The problem is I have every Saturday from 4:30 to 6 o'clock, another happy hour with my golf buddies.
I golf today too, Claude. I get it. I showed up late as well for golfing.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
So the Bourbon Trail consists of a number of distilleries, and you can you don't have to book it. You can just drive there, stay in a hotel, and visit them. But there are excursions so that you can book online. There are companies that will take you around to a number of breweries or distilleries, and you can typically only do 3, maybe 4 distilleries in a single day, because they're not right next to each other. Unless you're in Louisville, Kentucky, then there's about 5 of them in downtown Louisville. But they'll take you to the different ones, and you'll get to see different things at each one of the distilleries.
How far is it from Cincinnati?
It is not far. It's about an hour and a half away. So when you come, you've got a place to stay, and probably a partner to go with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have recently contract signed with a company which has a site in Indianapolis. You know that company, Dave. So it's not so far away from Cincinnati, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yep.
And amazingly,
it's a lot of fun.
Every distillery that you go to is the oldest distillery in the country.
In the world, I think. In the world.
Well, they won't go as far as the world because they're bourbon. They know that these Scottish and Irish are older, but everyone is the oldest one.
And it's pretty funny.
It really sounds like fun, yeah. Yeah, I used to work in Indianapolis a lot, and I visited Dave in Cincinnati, and so we crossed the Ohio and went to the other side of the Ohio and had my food in Kentucky, but that's it. So I've never been really to Kentucky.
He was able to check it off.
I checked it off, yeah.
but he needs to explore it. He needs a check plus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And in fact, Kara and I just went there right before everything shut down. We spent 3 days down there, and it was Kara's first time kind of going through those distilleries and everything. And she had Kara is my wife, and she had a great time there. It was a lot of fun.
Well, there's something of a potential crossover here. We've talked, well, I don't know, I think Keith mentioned a couple of weeks ago having something like a bourbon barrel aged some kind of beer. Is that what you're drinking today, Keith? I'm wondering, is there that might be an interesting second or additional topic to talk through here. Why would one do that? Is there with the complexity of the different the different whiskey styles, are there then an equally large number of potentially different beer styles from those different whiskeys? What's up with that, by the way?
So it's kind of interesting that so the bourbon barrel aged whiskeys are relatively new in the past, and at least as far as popularity in the past 10 years or so, it's really gained a lot of steam. Back in, because we're so close to Louisville, back in I can't remember the exact year. It was sometime in the 90s. One of the brewers from I think it was Bluegrass Brewing Company came up and visited our homebrew club, and they didn't have any homebrew clubs down there at the time. He came up and he said, "I want you guys to try some." And he was experimenting with putting beer into bourbon barrels and letting it age. And it was like, everybody was tasting it. And I was like, oh my God, this is so good. This is something that nobody else is doing. So it really started in the Louisville region, but probably, I don't know, 20% of the breweries in the United States are experimenting with barrel aging beers, either in bourbon barrels or rum barrels or new oak, or just trying a lot of different things. And it's just a matter of kind of trying to push beer to where it's never been before. And the tastes go very well together. If you've never had one, it's really delightful. If you like bourbon, if you don't like bourbon, you might not like it, but it's really delightful. It's a great combination, and kind of the more alcoholic, heavier the beer, it usually enhances it in the bourbon barrels. But the interesting thing about bourbon barrels themselves is that, so in Kentucky, and for bourbon, and you can only use a new barrel. You can't reuse a barrel for making bourbon. It's against the law to do that. It's not bourbon if you reuse the barrel. So they use the barrel once. Now you've got these beautiful barrels that could probably last another 50 years. Exactly. And what do you do with them? So you ship them to Ireland, you ship them to Scotland, you ship them to the Caribbean, you ship them to breweries, and they reuse those barrels. And those barrels still have in the wood, because when you age them for 8 years, 15 years, 20 years, the bourbon goes in and out of the wood over that period of time during the different seasons, heating and contracting. So the wood itself actually has the flavor of bourbon in it. So whatever you put into it will get a little bit of that flavor profile. Except for beer, it seems to get a lot of that flavor profile when you age the beer in there. It's really good.
That was a good explanation of that. By the way, I'm drinking a bourbon barrel aged beer today.
Nice.
It's Darkness by Surly. It's their 2020 bourbon barrel aged beer. It's a touch of chocolate, a touch of coconut, but it's heavy. It's a heavy bourbon barrel beer. It's 12%, and so I have this much left of the quart. So yeah. So I'm about to get in trouble upstairs. I mean, it's not your problem. It's mine. I get it. But yeah, so I've been a very bitter, dry beer kind of guy for a long time, and I didn't like the sweet beers very much, but I've really gotten onto these bourbon barrel aged stouts, and they are sweeter. But if there's bourbon behind it, I enjoy that a lot, and they'll get you in trouble though.
Yeah.
they will. But I enjoy those a lot, and yeah, I got this. So this is the quart that used to be.
Oh my God!
It's gone now.
Yeah.
There's that, but yeah. So I do love the bourbon barrel aged stouts a lot.
Is that a local brewery for up there?
So Darkness is Surly. So that's Minnesota. That's over in Minneapolis.
Okay.
And they do set aside quite a few barrels each year for this event. They do Darkness as a dark stout. They also do the barrel aged stouts, and the number of beers we get to choose from every year gets to be bigger. And since I do enjoy the less sweet, the more bitter and dry beers. The rye whiskey barrel aged beers are probably in my wheelhouse as my favorites.
This is not a. Have you ever heard of Hammerheart Brewing Company? They're in Minnesota, but I don't know where they are in Minnesota.
Can you say that again?
Hammerheart. I just bought this smoked American. It's called a smoked American lager.
Okay.
From Hammerheart Brewery in Minnesota, and I had never heard of them before. Lino Lakes, Minnesota.
Lino Lakes, I think.
Yeah. I had never heard of that before.
We'll say, Dave, though, when you talked about Listerman, we have a Black Tap event here in Eau Claire. It happens every year, and it happens to be the Wednesday before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Where the tap house in town puts on about 20 to 25 aged stouts, bourbon barrel aged.
Oh my God!
It's phenomenal. You can ask Steve. I took the day off this year. He had to sign my permission slip for this because it's that big of an event, and it was phenomenal. And Listerman had about 6 beers on tap here.
Really?
And they were great. Listerman did a great job of aging their beers. It was phenomenal.
When we talked about barrel-aged beers, how long is a beer aging in a barrel? Are we talking about years or weeks, or what is that?
It's typically months.
Months.
It's not. Yeah. It doesn't, because you're not trying to increase the alcohol in the beer. Like when you age a whiskey in a barrel, it goes in and out of the wood, it evaporates, it concentrates. You're not trying to do that. You're just trying to extract some of that flavor out of the beer. So it's months. It's not years.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But I think Keith may disagree though. And so Keith, what was the alcohol content of that thing you're drinking?
Well, it's gone now. It was 12%.
So obviously that was maybe part of the intent there. And to put this in perspective, so a quart is about a liter, right? And a quarter of a gallon. Yep. And a wine bottle is 750 milliliters, and a typical wine is about 13, 14%, 12 to 14% alcohol. So you basically just drank a bottle of wine.
Again.
It happens.
It means, but Steve is telling you it's nothing what you drank.
There's nothing wrong.
Go and get another one.
Yeah, I'll be right back. I got another one of.
Sounds better that you drink a bottle of beer instead of a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so, Claude, what are you drinking this evening?
This first time I'm trying it, actually. It's called Shorts Brew. It's out of Michigan. It's Rapid Alex. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's like a porter. It's really pretty good. First time I'm trying it, so it's really my son actually has been buying it. He's been hiding it. I haven't seen it yet.
So who's the brewery?
Shorts Brewing.
Can you show us the bottle?
You see it?
Oh, there it is. Move it a little bit. There you go.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Greg has something he wants to say. Greg?
No.
Oh, sorry.
is that Thomas there? Hello?
It is
Tom.
That's Thomas.
Hey. Hey. Long time no see.
So, guys, it's looking like it's looking like this may be a good opportunity to start to draw Beer Chat 3 to a close here. I know I like to be the wet blanket on all the parties and fun. I would propose that we gather again in 2 weeks' time, if folks are interested. We will need a topic or a presenter. A couple of thoughts. I'm thinking that it might be fun to hear all about the history of hops. I was intrigued when Dave talked about hops as being a flower. I'm thinking, what a brilliant Mother's Day or anniversary gift is to give somebody a bouquet of hops flowers.
That's exactly what my mom was getting.
But so I think before we close here, does anyone else have any additional thoughts or comments they want to make about the smoke beer, the Rauch beer tonight, and anyone interested in being the lead-in act, let's say, for a beer chat number 4 here in 2 weeks' time?
Why don't we dig a little bit deeper into these barrel-aged beer? My impression is there are some experts here in this chat.
I would take that one on.
Woo!
All right.
Awesome.
All right.
I can't top Dieter and Joe's and Dave's presentations, but I will do what I can.
You will do great. And if
I
you
will do what I can.
I'm sure you can. I'm absolutely sure you can.
Yeah, it's not like we're going to banish you from the group if you don't do well.
I'll still show up and drink beer. So.
Good. Well, we're pretty much at the 90-minute mark here. I think it's a good time to step away. Dave, thank you again so much for that fabulous lead-in. And I will say that I was less intrigued by the beers you were showing than that plate of food that you were showing that looked like some kind of a lovely. And Dieter will attest to this. If there was ever a time Dieter wanted to probably kill me, is when I ordered the Bavarian specialty sitting in downtown Dusseldorf, the Schweinshaxe. He kind of gave me that funny look. But that kind of looked like that. It looked like a potato dumpling on there. It looked fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, so look, it sounds like, and so I'm seeing at least 3 group tours here. We gotta the first tour we gotta go do, or maybe it's not the first one, but we've got the International Group Beer Day, February 1st. So there's probably a trip to Ireland in all our futures. I think we got to do the bourbon tour in Kentucky, and I think we also probably need all to make our way to.
If you ever let us in again, we will do that.
It has nothing to do with the COVID virus, Dieter. It's all about.
I know. I understand that.
Good. Well, guys, thanks again. Wonderful chat. I appreciate everybody's contribution, and I look forward to seeing you all again in a couple of weeks' time.
All right.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Good night, guys.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.